Hello.
Hello? That's my boobs. That's garbage. I don't pay for today.
What was that?
Can I have double pay for today?
That's probably fair.
People are crazy.
How are you feeling, Bethany? I'm Courtney.
Hey,
Hi.
Courtney, nice to meet
How are
you.
you feeling?
I am on the mend, I think.
Good.
So still kind of dragging, but definitely better than yesterday.
Good.
Anyone? Oh, a year. They probably told you back a year. I did. I was only kidding.
No, it's true. Me and about half of us got it. I
West.
played it.
That was back in the day of the transition room, though, wasn't it?
Right.
So you were just transition.
Yeah, right. Well,
So
yeah, I
there.
don't wanna say that, yeah, I never thought of that one.
Well, yeah, that way I always thought about it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
Did all three of you grow up in Portland?
Oh,
No.
Just
Bozeman.
Oh, Bozeman. Oh.
Texas.
What was it? The Bozeman.
She knows as much about Brooklyn as I do.
I was gonna say, it
Yeah.
feels like,
Is she
pretty much.
taught here, right?
oh,
Oh, 4 years, that doesn't count.
I still teach, but she
Uh-huh.
lived here for 40.
Yeah, no, 50 this year.
50.
50 this
Sorry,
year.
50.
And people do not seem to be getting any saner.
Oh my gosh, well, yeah. Why would you wanna do that? No. There's.
What?
Like a peanut.
I know. Well, you see the picture of her that I found when she was in like the second grade.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
really funny.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Is he younger than she is?
I don't know.
I think he has a couple.
He might be. I don't know.
I think he's a couple of years younger than.
Who is that?
Cindy Farway.
That's Cindy Farway? Next one.
this is the real value of annuals
Oh,
right
yeah,
there.
they're so funny.
so
I
and
wish
so?
you Just look, she was really cute. Oh, man.
She is really cute.
Yeah.
She is really cute.
But I would have never. Never mind.
They did another property here at Somersault. They were really good friends. Flannel went down to the wedding. They get together every summer celebration and drive around town and drink.
Just like the others.
They do.
Yeah. Oh, that's. Yep.
They do.
Bethany, when's your print day?
Wednesdays.
Wednesday.
Oh, boy.
Ahead of the curve.
Well, we print in Helena, so we get them back Wednesday night and they go out in Thursday's mail.
Okay.
So it's it got slowed down. We used to get them out by Wednesday afternoons when the Tribune was able to print us, but
Oh, yeah.
now it takes a little longer.
And she's bossy.
We could.
You mean she has leadership skills?
Yeah, she has leadership skills.
Should we move
Thank you.
up?
That's such a nice way to put it. I said that's
That's
such
how-
a nice way to put it.
Yeah, that's how I taught my daughter to respond when someone called her bossy.
Here,
So tell them that you have leadership skills.
I gotta remember.
That's right. I finally got heat by the end of the day.
I'm glad it finally worked. My goodness, how cold did it get in there?
It was 60 about.
Oh, good
I
grief.
went outside to go do something.
It was warmer
and
outside.
it's warmer outside.
Oh, no.
It was inside. So then when Conley showed up, we pushed all the buttons in the back. I wasn't going to touch any of the buttons. And that finally. It finally came
I had to
on.
do that a couple of times this winter, or fall. It keeps shutting itself off. So
I know.
I'm glad they have a new one on order.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think they do anyways.
Well,
our new boiler shuts off all the time too. So.
Oh,
Here.
good. Just a boiler thing, I guess. You just have to watch them really close.
I don't know.
Weird.
Could be. Doesn't have me,
See, I take these all around so I can prove that I'm hydrated. They're all full, but.
What else? What else?
And water.
Oh, 3 options.
Coffee is a diuretic.
I don't care. It's good. I could have some other diuretics in.
The annual. Please, please. Oh my gosh. So you're not really staying hydrated if you're drinking coffee.
It's liquid.
It's a diuretic.
I know, I saw that picture. Gasser. I know, I saw that. Just, but oh my God. Back in the day.
That was all I heard.
Wade Curtis. Give him a Dallas.
There were 4 Curtis boys. Their father worked at the courthouse.
She knows everything.
She sounds like
Yeah,
it.
worked at the courthouse. We played cards with them.
Let's see who have you met. I met Lisa. I think.
Granger?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Where's Mike?
Yeah, it looks like.
There is, Coco's
Ooh.
brother.
Oh.
Mary Lynn.
I think it's the same. There were hotel marks and children too.
There were, Ricky.
Who's that?
Rhonda.
She hasn't changed from that.
Rhonda who?
Rhonda
Oh,
Stovall.
yeah.
She hasn't. Oh. Different keeper, tall basketball player.
He's the one that became a physical therapist.
No, I don't know where yet. I have no idea.
When are we supposed to start?
5:30.
What time is it?
You might be the crowd.
We might be the crowd. There's a crowd upstairs, but they're eating.
Well.
Oh,
They
well,
should just bring it
That's,
down.
that's,
invited them.
that's what we did wrong.
Yeah.
We should have had food.
I invited them down. Oh. Who's that?
Robin. Lava. Oh, wow.
The first time he came in here after he moved back, if April hadn't come up the stairs behind him, I would have called the police. Oh,
Nice guy.
Well,
He was probably just out. Well, that time. Some missteps there.
he had some steps.
He's a good dad.
Yeah. He's got good kids.
they got to sit on the goalpost.
That's sweet. Some families that let him get caught.
Lisa, maybe the class officer,
They probably had a ladder so they could get up there.
That's funny.
That's before people.
What are we talking
Here
about?
comes someone.
Dumb way I get fired for a second. What are we talking about?
We're talking about local journalism, local news. Wonderful.
Hi, Colleen.
Well, man.
Man, that's right.
Hi, I'm Courtney.
Nice to meet you. I'm
I
Colleen.
didn't get your names.
Oh, Carolyn,
Carolyn,
Sissy,
Sissy, nice to meet you.
and
And
Cynthia.
Cynthia,
And Emily's mother.
yes.
Yeah. Unforgettable. You can take that any way you want to.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So should we get started?
Sure.
All right. Okay, so, my name's Courtney. I just met you all and I met Bethany. I teach journalism at the University of Montana. And, yes. No,
It's that week. It's that
it
week.
is true. This is the wrong week to be, yeah,
Yeah.
parading around as a grizz, I suppose. So, and one of the things that I do in my work is I study local news in particular. I've always been interested in local news. I grew up in a really small town. And so I've watched local news trends for the last, throughout my career in journalism. I worked as a reporter for about 10, 15 years before I left to become a farmer. As if you could, find a less lucrative career than being a local journalist. And then I started teaching journalism, which again, the spiral of my earning potential was really not great.
You weren't in it for the money.
I've never been in it for the money. But one of the stories that I share about why I'm interested in local news is when I was growing up, my town, Dutton, had a little newspaper that was printed out on 11 by 17 paper in Bonnie Powell's laundry room. And I usually, after I went to college and started my journalism career, I didn't see it I saw it a little bit differently as I started working for, some of the statewide dailies. And I had this idea that there were two kinds of journalism and one was better than the other. You can guess how a 20-year-old might think about these things. I used to joke that I would make the front page of the paper every time I came home to visit my parents. Courtney Lowry came to visit her parents this weekend, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And
I understand.
you know it. And so
that's in town and around.
In town and around, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But my senior year of college, I was just getting ready to start a new job. I was graduating and I was going on to cover the legislative session, the Montana legislature for all of the lead newspapers in the state with Chuck Johnson, who was a legendary state house reporter, recently in the last few years, unfortunately passed away. He was a mentor of mine. In any case, I was going on to this big job where I was going to be in the Capitol building covering what I saw as big J journalism. Judy Mertz.
Oh,
yeah, she was really fun to cover. She was a talker and yeah, really, she was engaging. Anyway, but right before I was leaving and then the first week of the first few weeks of my gainful employment, before I left that gainful employment for less gainful employment later in my career, I was diagnosed with a really rare form of cancer in my right wrist. And I had to, it was the first time my mom had ever been on a plane. I had to go to Seattle to get this special treatment from this special surgeon. And before I left, someone at the newspaper wrote a little something that Julie Lowry was going to take her daughter to Seattle for this surgery. My mom was a second grade teacher for many years at Dutton Elementary. And but the week before we left, people started stopping in at her classroom and dropping things off. And when we got on the plane, I was like, Mom, what is that? We're only going for a few days. What is that suitcase? Why did you bring so much? We landed in Seattle and she opened up that suitcase and it was filled with gift cards and teddy bears and other stuffed animals and blankets and various letters and cards from kids and parents. And it was a critical moment in my personal life, but also a critical moment in my life as a budding journalist in recognizing the value that all kinds of local news has. And all kinds of news has, I was up there at the Capitol, like informing people about what their elected officials were doing. And one of the best pieces of journalism that I wrote during that time was a thank you letter that was published in the last issue of the Dutton Dispatch.
The very last issue?
One of the very last. I should make sure, I should fact check myself on that. It was one of the very last ones. And the paper went out of business or stopped printing that year in 2003. And from there on out, I built a journalism career. I worked at the Associated Press. I started a magazine in Missoula. But I've always been really interested in supporting and amplifying the voices of local news producers like Bethany, who do the important work of being both paper of record and also the paper of the community, and providing those checks and balances and that record and witnessing history, but also being a mirror to these communities. And one of the things that I have found in one of my other hats that I wear is I'm on the board of the Red Ants Pants Foundation, and we do a lot of work around placemaking and rural communities, and what makes a rural community a rural community. And that's something I've been interested in for a long time. And one of the things that is a community asset when you look at what makes a town. Of course, there's the bar, and of course, there's the churches. Of course, there's the school. There's a grocery store, which is also really critical, post office, and there's also a newspaper. And coming from a town that the town of Dutton, which, in a very short time lost its newspaper, lost its grocery store, and then consolidated schools, all within in the scope of basically when I was like 16 to the time I was like 22. I saw that very, very clearly, that what happens to a town when they lose those big pillars of the community. So that's why I'm really interested in talking about local news in communities, and talking about what the challenges are, and what the opportunities are, and why it matters to people. So today I'm going to interview Bethany, and apparently Connie and Cynthia too, about the value of local news and what goes into a local newspaper. And then tomorrow I'll talk about kind of both the national and the statewide picture, and what's happening to newspapers and why that matters. What's happening to news in general and why that matters to our communities, but also our democracy. So I'm going to start by asking you a bunch of questions, Bethany. And I sent you these beforehand, which I know is it's a cardinal sin as a journalist, that you knew what questions I was going to ask beforehand, but it's not really a sin. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, because these ladies might all know this already, but what drew you to local journalism, and why did you come to Fort Benton?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Can you guys hear me okay? Is it?
Yep, you're good. This owl thing is really fancy.
Oh, good. So I can kind of relate to the judgy 20-year-old college journalism student. I also came from a small town in Oregon that had a weekly newspaper. I think it was actually twice a week at that time. And, it had a lot of typos, and I always kind of, I think, looked down at it at that point in my life. And in college, I did some internships at some larger papers or some dailies, and then ended up, lo and behold, getting a job. My first real job was at that newspaper in my old hometown. And so, of course, that kind of slowly changed my view on what it meant to be in local news and all of the work that goes into it. I began to see that the reason there was typos is because there's not a copy editing staff. You have, one or two people that are trying to wear a whole bunch of different hats, and usually scrambling at the last minute to get everything to the press. So I have a lot more sympathy for that now, and it happens to be a lot. So as I was working there, I was there for about 5 years, and I was kind of thinking, like, okay, what types of stories do I like to cover? Do I want to? Several of the previous journalists that had been in my position before had gone on to like the LA Times, or had really like pushed for another one, went into like international coverage in Ukraine, and they like really went out there. And so I was like, is this the route I want to take? Do I want to just make it my life? And or I wasn't sure. I didn't know, but I was kind of starting to realize that maybe my niche was a little bit more in local news and sort of like building relationships with the city mayor and school superintendent and all of those people, and kind of like getting to know them and what's going on, and rather than, you know, being like more of a correspondent type role. So this wasn't really my plan, but I, through a odd course of events, I started dating a farmer in Fort Benton.
How all stories go sideways, just for the record.
Yes. So long story short, and it was always like, well, I don't know what I would do in Fort Benton. They didn't really have, you know, that at that time the owner and publisher did most of the reporting. But then at some point he decided to hire a full-time reporter, and I applied for it and got you know, he offered me an interview, and that all went well. And then he offered me the pay he offered me was actually better than what I was making. It still wasn't anything impressive, but it was better than what I was making as an editor at the paper that I. So that made it pretty easy to say yes and move to Fort Benton. And I did end up marrying that farmer. So now I'm kind of stuck in Fort Benton. I didn't ever intend I didn't ever intend on buying the paper. You know, I was always interested in the writing side of journalism and the being a journalist. I've never had an interest in the business side, the publishing side. But then it just kind of, when he first came to me and said, would you be interested in buying it? I said no. And then but I did still want to work for the paper, and I really liked my job, and we weren't sure what was going to happen. He was moving out of state, so it wasn't going to work long term for him to keep the paper. And then there was interest from like someone in New Jersey maybe wanting to buy it, and that made me kind of nervous because I'm like, what are they going to do with the paper? And so at that point, I decided to go ahead and buy the paper, just to make sure that it really did stay local. So.
Awesome. And was it a good call? Was that the right decision?
Depends on what day you asked me.
Really? We have a unanimous yes over here.
Yes, most of the time I say yes. There are times that I'm like, why did I do this? But then I'm also like, well, what else would I be doing? Like, honestly, even with the challenges, like it has been a really great experience. I've had a really supportive community, and I don't regret that at all. So I feel like I'm able to use like my skill set well in this position. And so yeah, I think it was meant to be.
Good. Why does it matter to you? Why do you think, what gets you up in the morning? What's your purpose?
I think just knowing that, you know, it's expected. The River Press has been publishing since 1880, pretty much nonstop, at least once a week. For a time, it was a weekly, and the community counts on it and depends on it. And I feel like it's really important that we have it, not only for current events and for keeping everybody up to date on what's going on, but also as a record, a historic record. We use the River Press archives a lot for research, and I know a lot of historians use it. So it's hard to think of it that way, like with what we're producing now, that will ever be historic, but the reality is that is what it is. So
it's the first draft of history, right?
It is, yeah.
That's what I teach my journalism students. You're writing the first draft of history, so you better get it right.
Right.
They don't always, just for the record.
I can remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm chewing on this thing that you said about building relationships, that you enjoyed building the relationships with the people that you were covering. And I think that's a particular, you know, in all of the research that shows that the difference in trust in local media and the trust in national media, and in particularly in rural places where for some communities, if we're not lucky enough to have a river press, the only experience that we have with quote unquote journalism or the media is when national news organizations or statewide news organizations will parachute in and drop in. And that really is one of the things that I know research shows, you know, erodes trust, particularly in marginalized communities and undercovered communities, which would include rural places. How do you see your role? And it's different, right? For a local journalist, you know, I really admired Melody Martinson over at the Show to Acantha, because the people that she covers, even if it's a tough coverage day, she still runs into them at Rex's at the grocery store. So it's just a different relationship than a journalist who's coming in, covering maybe a problem or a controversy, and then being able to parachute out. But you have to live here and see those people on a regular basis. Can you speak a little bit about, or maybe you have an example of when that kind of approach to reporting and journalism, of building relationships, has benefited you or has been a challenge? Or this is a very squishy question, I'm very sorry. But can you talk about how that looks in practice, that building relationships, and what kind of coverage comes out of it?
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely had some really awkward phone calls, interactions with that you just dread. And to be honest, there have been times that I've probably avoided something because I just didn't know how to handle it in such a small town. I mean, to be honest, that does happen. I try not to let that be a factor, but sometimes I do chicken out. But I think in a lot of ways it's benefited, or once you've like built some trust, they're more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt and also understand that you're just doing your job, because they've seen you at all of the other things. So they know that you're not just some muckraker that's like trying to stir something up. Like, you're just trying to do your job well. And I think people do take that into consideration and realize it. So, and I can certainly, I'm struggling to think of any good, like, solid examples. But I know there've been,
Cynthia has one.
Cynthia has one. What do you have, Cynthia?
Well, the whole brouhaha about the heritage. You know, we lost subscriptions and we gained subscriptions. You know, that whole thing, because people don't really understand, you know, and she did a really nice job. And the guy that I get the weather from out of Carter, he texted me one day and said, is she going to print that article that the lady was she from New York?
Yeah, she was from the New York Times, or I think it was a he, or the reporter that wrote that article.
Yeah, and he texted me and said, is she going to print that article? I said, no, she's not going to print that article. She already printed it last week. And, you know, and we had people call up, all our relatives, and cancel. You know, we had a lot of cancellations, but we gained, and we gained a ton of trust. She gained a ton of trust, I think. You know, to me, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, definitely. And that was kind of an odd case where we actually requested to run a story that had been published in the New York Times. So not something we would typically do. But yeah, it was on the National Heritage Area controversy, and they'd done kind of somewhat of an expose, I guess, on one of the leaders behind the effort to stop it. And so they'd done some good journalism, and yeah, we decided to print it, and yeah, there was some fallout. But I also had people coming up to me in the street and saying, thank you for publishing that. It was really good to read that perspective. And so it goes both ways. And usually my experience has been that usually the things that I like stress about the most and think like that we're going to get a ton of flack for, it ends up almost being opposite, in that like we might get some flack, but usually we almost get more support because of it. So I mean, it just depends on what it is, but people seem to appreciate when you take those journalistic risks a little bit. As long as you're coming from a place of sound journalism and making sure that it's accurate and well reported. People, not everybody, but a lot of people can see when that's happening. So.
And are those the kinds of stories that you find build trust? Those sound journalism stories where you have to dig a little bit deeper. Do you find that those are the stories that build trust?
I think so. Yeah, I do. And I think also, even just, with it being such a small town, so many people have connections to the school board or the city council. And so just having that regular presence, that you're always there, you're always reporting on them, from month to month what the topics are that they're discussing, who they're talking about, and why it's an issue. Like, you have all of that background, and so it just informs the writing. You have all of that background information so that you can write a clear story, I think. So I feel like that helps too.
The context matters. Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes approach kind of big J and little J journalism. Little J journalism, big J journalism is probably, like you're doing the things like covering the city council and covering the school board and those kinds of things. And then there's little J journalism where you're covering the pumpkin carving contest or those kinds of things. What's your approach to those different kinds of stories, and how do you mix them, and how do you decide where to go with both of those kinds of stories? Do you believe that there's a role for both of them as a local newspaper? Do you find your readers asking for more of one or the other?
Yeah, I think it is a balance. I noticed that I think it's really important that we cover city council, school board, those kinds of things. Sometimes those aren't the most interesting stories to read, and they're probably not our most well read. But I still think it's important that we're there and that we're covering it. And then at some point there will be something that people care about that happens at one of those meetings that they'll be more interested in. But those aren't the type of stories that tend to generate the most interest always. People love to see their grandkids and children in the newspaper. And so pumpkin carving type events are great for that. Also, we notice at our paper, there's a lot of subscribers who live out of state now, who grew up here and want to maintain that connection. And so they like seeing that Fort Benton still does their Halloween window painting contest. We did that when I was a kid. And some of that nostalgic tradition, the homecoming traditions, things like that. People like to see that that's still happening. And they like to see who's participating too, because they recognize those names and those faces.
And that's that important mirror part that a good community newspaper, right?
I think so, yeah.
How do you measure audience attention for things, or your community's attention for things? Do you measure it? Do you take it into account? What are you looking for when you're choosing what to write about and what not to write about? Like, what's the litmus test for those things? And is attention part of that? community wants and needs? How do you balance that with what you think is important and what the community thinks is important? Or often maybe they match. Go ahead.
Yeah, sometimes they do. I think we are pretty limited in our staffing, and so we don't always get to do as much in-depth or cover as many things as we would like. That's often a barrier. But I would say, like, if we're getting lots of letters to the editor on a topic, or if I'm just hearing lots of questions in the community, then I'll try to focus more on that. So an example of that would be, we used to never go to library board meetings just because there's only so many meetings that you can regularly make it to in a month.
Right.
But in more recent times, the library board suddenly started getting inundated with community members coming to their meetings, and it took more of a front row seat. And so we started attending those and covering them, and there was a lot of interest in that. So it does, we try to keep our ears open to what the community is interested in, and I get ideas from people often, and if somebody takes the time to like give me a news story idea, I really try to follow up on it if it has any sort of merit, because I appreciate people reaching out.
That's great. I'm curious as to, as someone who hasn't been here a whole lot, how long have you been in Fort Benton?
10 years now.
Oh, good. Okay, great. How long did it take you before you felt like people accepted you as part of as an embedded reporter, as someone who was in here for the long haul? Like, and what did that look like, and what did you do in your coverage, or even in just like listening to people? What did you do to build that trust and that relationship with the community?
Yeah, I feel like Fort Benton was pretty welcoming to me. I was kind of worried about that, especially being from out of state. But everybody had been pretty welcomed me with open arms pretty much. I didn't feel a lot of cold shoulders when I first came here. And it was definitely a huge learning curve though, because everybody knew who I was. They're like, oh yeah, the new girl at the River Press. And I didn't know who anybody was. And I also didn't know any of the connections. So many people are related to each other through marriage or different things. And that I am still learning. Cynthia often clues us in. I also don't know, like, people around here often talk about, well, so-and-so's house where somebody used to live, and I don't have any context for that really. So there's still plenty of holes there. I'm definitely not like a full-blown local yet, probably, but I do feel pretty accepted and integrated into the community. And I don't know if it's I can't think of like anything that I really did. I would like to think that I came fairly open-minded and not with a lot of preconceived notions. So I just, for the most part, let the community tell me who they were instead of assuming that I knew that. I think that would be my biggest tip for a journalist going into a new community. And just kind of feel it out. And you just learn a lot it was a great way to get to know the community, because I had to be at all the events and meetings for my job, so it just kind of forced me to get to know a lot of people really fast.
It's good. I often tell my students that it's like a magic secret pass being a journalist. You get to go to all the things and meet all the people and talk to all the people and ask them questions, and it's kind of a backstage pass to life.
It really is. There have been quite a few times where I'm like, I don't feel like I belong here. I don't know what I'm doing here, but it's a cool opportunity.
So, I guess, let's see, a study from Gallup and the Knight Foundation from last February, I found this really striking. The study found that local news organizations far outpace their national counterparts. 44% of Americans report high emotional trust in local news organizations. And about half that, 21%, reporting high trust in local, in national news organizations. Is that something that you've seen in your work and in the work of your counterparts in other communities like Fort Benton? And why do you think that is?
I think so, and I it doesn't surprise me because I think it's because people know us. For the most part, the community knows who you are, so we're not just some byline. You know, in a larger news organization, you wouldn't know, the names don't mean anything as far as who's reporting unless you follow really closely. But for most of the public, that's not the case. But in this context, I think people see me at all kinds of local events. They see me taking pictures at high school games, and they and all kinds of things. And so there's that maybe that understanding that I am local and I'm here. I'm not just some random person.
And you care.
Yeah,
Enough to,
my community too.
show up at high school football games and high school
Right.
basketball games. Yeah.
Right.
And sports plays a big role in it, right? Sports coverage is a key part of the local news ecosystem.
I don't know what they do now currently, but at one point the Tribune had stopped running a lot of the local high school stats, at least in like a real timely manner. And so, and I was hearing about it constantly from locals saying, well, that Tribune doesn't cover anything of, we want to read about our local teams. And yeah, there's huge interest in that. We have kind of a unique tradition, or it was unique to me. At the River Press, often the high school coaches here submit write-ups about their team. So that has been nice. For the most part, we just get submissions from the coaches each week, depending on the sport. We don't have like a sports reporter, or we haven't as far as I know, the paper hasn't had that. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, but either we try, if we try to at least get write-ups from the coaches, or I try to at least get the scores from the games if we don't have something from the coach, so that we're kind of keeping up on those local teams. We do try to get to as many of the home games as we can to get pictures. Again, people like to see their grandkids, and just we have a lot of people in town who follow sports who don't have grandkids on the teams, but they just love their local teams. So,
and probably people from out of state too, right? Who are checking in on that makes a big difference. So another some more striking stats about kind of the news ecosystem is of course the decline of newspapers and news organizations in general. Like if you look at the map of the news deserts across the United States, they're increasing all the time. I think the stat that I saw said something like only that there are 10% of US counties don't have a paper of record at all. They don't have access to news, not even a paper. And one study I read said that, what was it, every, we're averaging 2 newspapers dying every week in the US right now, which is pretty significant. And there's news deserts where there are no papers, or there's also something called ghost newspapers or ghost news organizations, which started my career at the Tribune. I don't mean to, disparage them by any stretch of the imagination, because it has a long history, and the people who work there work very, very hard and are working, with what they've got. But there's just not much there anymore. And I think that's happening with a lot of the metro dailies, but also, we're seeing, increased pressure on rural papers as well. but most of them seem to be doing okay. I mean, even despite all of the terrible things that are happening in the news business, everything from classified advertising to going away, to the shift of the business model, to what is it like, in 2018 is when we surpassed most Americans now get their news on social media as opposed to directly from a news organization. Why does that matter? Why does that matter to our communities, and to our nation? And how is the River Press holding on? Like, what is making it work for the River Press to stay alive and doing important work in the community?
Yeah. Well, the first part of that question, I think it's really scary that we're losing so many newspapers, because that means we're losing journalists. And it means that we have a lot of government meetings that are not being covered at all. And our whole country was set up with journalism being the fourth estate, essentially, with the expectation that journalists would be holding the government accountable and that they would have access to do that. And I think that's a really important piece of our democracy. So when we stop funding journalists, we're losing pieces of that. And it's not good. It's very, very tough. I mean, I'm sure the Tribune's a good example of, I know they have much fewer journalists on staff right now than they used to. And so that means they're making it to far less things that they would have covered before, because one or a few people can only do so much. And that's happening all over the place. So I think it's a huge concern, locally and nationally, because none of us we really do depend on journalists to bring us the stories of what is happening on a national, state, and local level. As an individual, I really can't do all of that well. I can't keep tabs on every single thing that matters. I need to rely on some educated people whose job it is to cover that and to share the information with me. So I don't know. I hope we don't continue that trend. I think it's really concerning. Part two of the question, I think the River Press is doing well subscriber wise. We've held steady. I think we actually had a slight, and I mean very, very slight, but I think we had a slight uptick last year. And but I'm nervous. I'm nervous that just the culture of, because people are relying so heavily on social media, that they're kind of forgetting what newspapers are and how to read one. And I mean, from my perspective, it doesn't really matter if they read it online or in print. But I do want them to pay attention to where their information is coming from, and to make sure it's coming from a reputable source. And I'm not certain that is, I'm concerned that we're losing some of that. So right now we have really good community support, and that's how we're able to hold on. I think being so niche and so hyper local is what has us going. There's no one else that is covering Choteau County news and Fort Benton news. So we really don't have competition in that respect. Also, I guess the flip side of that is we're doing well as far as like readers, but costs are going, I mean, as with every business right now, postage has gone up like astronomically in the last few years. And that's how we mail out the paper. We don't use carriers, so we do all mail for ours. And basically every printing has gone up. Printing presses are closing. So like I'm pretty concerned about about Helena hanging on, because if that's where we're currently printing. there's only a few presses still printing in Montana. And they're hard to get press slots with. I mean, they're busy. And it's also, I know they're having challenges too, because printing is like a very skilled job. It's not something you can just throw anybody into. And they're having a hard time keeping their staffing up to where they need it to be. And while they seem to have plenty of work, it's not like the most lucrative business, is my understanding. I don't know a lot about the printing side of the business, but I don't know, that seems to be a challenge, and we've been seeing a lot of presses closing all over the country, I think. So there's plenty to be concerned about. Even though we've been pretty insulated from a lot of the big problems here in our small town paper.
If you could, well, first I'll ask you, why does a community newspaper matter to all of you?
I think there's a certain level of accountability that comes with covering the local stuff. Like for example, school board or the library.
The swimming pool.
The swimming
city.
pool, like it's just the things that start kind of becoming the talk of the town also become the talk of the newspaper, I think. But it also just holds those places accountable too for what is being said. And like one example I had where it's like awkward after the fact, because it's people you'll still run into in different businesses, was with our animal shelter that I think is cursed, like with that board at this point, just because it seems to always have that curse following it, that there's just that certain level of drama that follows. But it seems like that was like an instance for me where I like kind of woke up to see the accountability side of journalism, and it's not just like, oh, I have to cover this meeting where there's probably going to be some yelling and like words flying that no one wants to hear. But I think it's really important just for the accountability aspect, but also like in addition to like documenting future history, essentially. But
Well, and we also have a lot of older people in this community that they wouldn't know what's going on unless they read the paper. So it keeps them informed and know what's going on and what's going on in the neighborhood. And Bethany has covered a lot of issues that were, I would call a hot spot, that she had to come in and she kept her opinions out and she just stated the facts of what was really going on. And I think people trust her, so they really want to hear, because you know, in a small town there's rumors constantly. So if you don't have someone in there reporting the facts, the truth of what's going on, I think it helps people see what's really happening out there too.
And that's so, it seems so simple, but it's also so hard, right? To stick to just the facts. It seems simple, but it takes a lot of, it takes skill and it takes guts and hard work to do that kind of work.
And I think when she writes it, people trust that.
Yeah.
You know, and that makes a difference for many opinions on hot spots.
I'm totally stealing hotspots as for my next class.
Well, and then you have basic things. I type up the menus for the school menus, and for like a month, Fort Benton didn't have the menus, and mothers were going berserk on Facebook because, you know, they wanted, their kids want to know what to eat every single day, you know. I mean, even on that very basic level, what's for lunch?
Or even at the Golden Age Center.
Well, yeah, the Golden Age Center too. You know, I typed up both those, and people want to know on a day-to-day level that's not controversial or anything, just, you know, in May and June we get 1,000 calls. When is the pool open? I mean, everybody, you know, they just want to know how to plan their day.
Yeah.
You know, and
Basic.
it's not, yeah, that's just basic stuff.
Right.
It's not even
Mhm.
controversial.
Mhm.
Yeah, for a small paper in a small town, there's a lot that's going on, really, you know, like, when are we gonna have this meeting? We've had that happen all the time, and it's like, she's busy, they're busy and they do a good job. Well, we were just at some friend's house in Great Falls this weekend, and everywhere I go, I hear they grab the Fort Benton paper, and that's what we do Sunday morning, we have our coffee and read the
Oh, that's
paper,
awesome.
it's tradition, that's what people do on Sunday morning.
And I go through the old annuals and put in not so much sport teams, but like, you know, things from way back. And you'll see stuff, people will say, oh, did you see she featured us? You know, people really like that.
You'll also have people call that were in the picture if you missed a line when you're typing the names.
Oh, yeah, yes, right. We're also accountable, right?
Yes.
Really.
Well, hasn't Wally been putting stuff in the paper about history of old buildings and
Yeah,
people
she's-
and
yeah.
stuff like that, which is.
But then you have that other faction that still want Muncie. And yesterday, Collie rode her horse from one end of town to the other. I mean, there's still Wally's doing more historical things and
Yeah.
stuff like that, but Muncie did.
The day-to-day.
Meat and potatoes.
Yeah, you know, so and so went out, so and so left, you
Right,
know,
right.
stuff like, and people still
Yeah.
want.
But out and about, yeah.
Yeah.
When I first moved here, we had several communities, the Knees community, you got news from the Knees and.
Week in the knees.
Week in the.
What was that what it was called?
It was.
I don't think my heart can handle that, that's amazing.
You, and from a few little places up around Chester and stuff like that.
Highwood, wasn't there the Highwood?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
but the in town and around, I mean, people want to know that kind of stuff, cause I still have people saying they want Muncie, you know.
And that's not stuff that you can get on social media, I mean, you can, but you can't. You can't,
View,
not in that way.
Muncie was viewed from the bridge,
Oh, it's a good one.
but yeah, Week in the Knees, that's right.
But we all look and see who got a ticket and.
Oh, sure, of course, of course.
You know, you just, but I hear it every day, all five of us sitting here. You hear it every day.
Yeah.
How good she is and how good we are, you know, it's just, the gal that is doing our exercise class from PT said her father says to her every week, where's the Fort Benton newspaper? And he lives in Great Falls. So she's gonna get him a subscription, but
Well, or like we had Empower Montana came in August, and then the one woman told her mom about it and she called her press and asked for her to send if there was an article with a picture and sent a check or a donation check or whatever, and
yeah, I mean, we hear stuff from all over. We get thank yous in bill payments all the time,
Oh, that's great.
all the time. We have thank yous in bill payments. You
well,
know,
and
just-
obituaries too are
Yeah.
pretty.
Yes, can I call the funeral home tomorrow and have them send me the obituary?
Easy.
Yeah, because Karen's obituary and. the
Oh, yes, I
funeral-
have Karen's obituary.
So I was gonna call him
I
today.
will
and
send it to you. Is that what you're wanting?
Yeah. I had a little old lady, right, who's been a friend of mine forever. She's a little old lady, she's 94. And I typed up the obituary for her brother last week off of, 5 little tiny sheets of
Oh,
paper
yeah.
that,
It's important,
Yeah,
it's a reflection, I mean, it's sort of we existed,
Well,
without.
Speaking of price and all those things, like, it's so affordable. We had friends who, they lived in Laramie for a number of years and in Moscow, Idaho for a number of years, but he was from here, and what was the price from like, it was like $700 or something.
we charge a flat $45 for
Oh,
obit.
you're kidding me.
You can't put an obit in the Bozeman paper for probably under.
I
Hundreds
paid,
of dollars.
I've unfortunately written and paid for quite a few obituaries in the last few years, and I paid upward around $1,200 for
Yeah,
this one.
yeah.
And we have had a lot since COVID. Bethany's had to up our stock of sympathy cards because we literally, I feel, have had a lot of deaths. And boy, if somebody like this gal died last Thursday and I've just been, people have called me at a moment.
Where's the
said,
obituary?
Where's the obituary? You know, that's another thing that's really important is just the thing that you don't see anymore is wedding pictures. You know, you used to get, and you know, those kinds of things, but obits are still huge for a local paper.
When I got married, I had to explain to my husband, even though the paper wasn't around at the time, we actually ended up putting it in the Shoto Acamp because the Dutton paper wasn't around. But I had to explain to him that we didn't send out wedding invitations. You just put it in the paper.
Oh, yeah. No, at the bottom it will say no local invitations.
Yes.
And people go, are you kidding?
Yeah, and he was, I mean, we did legitimately run out of food because we didn't, you know, because I had no idea how many people were gonna come, but this was a foreign concept to him. He grew up in a small town outside Great Falls.
I remember.
But they didn't have a paper, and so he didn't understand that, that's what you did, you just put the invitation in the paper.
And at the bottom it would say no local. No local invitations being sent. You know.
So, Bethany, or the group, if you could write a prescription for us as a society or for another community on what's needed to keep these kinds of publications alive and sustainable, what would that look like?
Younger people.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Go
just
ahead.
don't have. Yeah, we don't have younger people doing anything anymore. Except for you. You're welcome.
I was gonna say, like, pretty young. I mean,
But they're not the norm. You know, we were looking at on Friday on all the Veterans Day stuff. When that bunch of guys that fires those guns off go, there's nobody.
Right.
You know, you don't have, you can just look at our pictures of a variety of things, and there's the whole ag center, that whole bunch over there, they're all old, and you need to get somehow to get young people, besides beating them.
Or making them marry farmers. That seems to be the real coup for.
I think one of the biggest things is for people to value journalism and value what is good journalism, and that takes some education. And then to put a little bit of money behind it by subscribing to your local paper and then maybe a national newspaper, or more of a statewide publication as well. But setting a little bit of money aside, doesn't need to be a lot. I mean, our paper is, even for an out-of-state subscription, it's still under $50 for a year. And I know that's not the case for a lot of the dailies. It can get pretty expensive, but I think making sure that you are supporting journalism with a little bit of money is important, because advertising today, it used to be that newspapers were kind of a cash cow for advertising. They didn't have much competition or any competition. And now then radio and TV came, and then the internet came, and the bottom fell out. Because there is so much competition for advertising dollars now. So that made it even more important that for newspapers to have subscriber support. So that's one. And then I think the biggest thing is just making a point to be engaged, like to be an engaged citizen. It's kind of a lot of work, or it can be kind of time consuming. I don't think it has to eat up huge chunks of your time, but just making sure that you are staying somewhat connected to what's happening in your community and in your state, by making sure that you're seeking out some good quality journalism. And not just scrolling social media all the time. That's my biggest concern with what we're seeing with the move to social media, is that people, they say they're busy, and that's true. And they say they don't have time, but we're like finding plenty of time to spend on social media and other things. So I think we just need to be a little bit more thoughtful about that.
Yeah. The average American spends 8.5 hours on a screen. Not including, and that's teens too, and that's not including schoolwork.
Oh, wow.
So that goes to show you. Those are pretty good prescriptions.
Well, that's why orthopedics are a lot of these kids are. have
Job security.
Yeah, exactly.
Job security.
That's what they'll tell you. The orthopedics at the hospitals, they tell you. Kids are coming in.
Thank you, Bethany, unless any of you have questions for her.
Kind of raised.
We'll let you.
Definitely deserve one, so we should talk about it.
Oh, no.
I'll do an evaluation for you.
When you clean up your desk.
Oh, boy.
You found everything you needed to.
One more question, Bethany. What's your best, and this is selfish because I want to share it with my students. What's your best bit of advice for, you know, freshman, sophomore in college who's studying journalism? What would be your best bit of advice?
Okay, the first one that comes to mind is kind of stupid, but it also really makes you look stupid if you don't do it. So always ask how to spell names, because even John, it might be without an H. Like, you just need to double check. John's son can be E-N or O-N. There's just so many variations with names you don't want to assume. And I think more of a less silly one maybe is just try to set aside assumptions as much as you can. And also, when you go into an interview, kind of let the interview, you'll have the questions that you need answered, that you have in your head and or are written down, and that you want to make sure you hit on, and those are great. But don't be so married to that you don't ask follow-up questions and kind of let the interview go where it needs to go. Sometimes you can't really predict what the most interesting thing is going to be about your interview, and you might miss out on some pretty good information if you don't kind of follow your interviewee a little bit.
Good advice. Okay.
Maybe
Thank you.
she'll have an intern to send to you. next
Yeah,
summer.
you want an intern? I can send you an intern.
Yeah, we'd love an intern. We've had some great interns over the years. We haven't in the last one we had was 2020, so we do need to get another.
I'll send you one. I'll start singing your praises.
Okay, sounds great.
Great. Well, thank you. Go to bed now.
Okay.
Hydrate.
Go
to bed.
Thank you, everybody.
See ya.
Good night. See you.
Shelby wasn't popping up behind her.
How old?